Okay, this map I think shows it well. We're going into our next ecoregion called it's a level 3 ecoregion as well. It's called the Central Appalachians. And we only have really a kind of a little bit of it in Tennessee. But it's an important one. And I know we're not entirely focused on Tennessee, right? We've been talking a lot about North Carolina, and we're going to talk a lot about other states through this class. But I want you to understand how sort of I'm looking for representative Tennessee is of the larger sort of region around us. So obviously Tennessee is a long state, right? It's about 400 miles east to west. And it cuts across all of these provinces from the Blue Ridge to the Mississippi River floodplain. And because of that, it's almost like it takes a cross section of those regions, especially because those regions extend, you know, into and out of Tennessee, right? The Blue Ridge starts way up here and goes down into Georgia. Ridge and Valley starts way up here and crosses into Georgia and into Alabama. The Central Appalachians starts way up here, actually, you know, in New York. In central Pennsylvania, it comes all the way down here. The Appalachian Plateaus goes all the way to southwest New York, all the way to central Alabama. Okay? Interior plateaus starts up here near Cincinnati, Ohio, all the way to northern Alabama. And then the coastal plains start in southern Illinois and go all the way down into Florida. What's the point? The point is that as I'm teaching you about Tennessee, you're learning about most of eastern North America, right? So these concepts you'll be able to take with you to many, many other regions. Maybe not the coast, right? Maybe not Florida so much, but certainly to most of the eastern interior portion of the United States, and it's going to serve you very well. Okay, Central Appalachians, level 3 ecoregion, and our area is comprised of 2 level 4 regions, the dissected Appalachian Plateau, 69D, and what's called the Cumberland Mountain Thrust Block, 69E. Now, the Cumberland Mountain Thrust Block is by far one of the very coolest examples of some plate tectonic mumbo jumbo. I mean, I'm talking about some serious land shifting and moving. Number one, 69E, you see the area I'm talking about right here? It's this sort of dark green region that comes down. It forms along the border of Kentucky and Virginia. It's mostly on the Kentucky side and slips down into Tennessee a little bit too. This region is really neat, and here's partly why. Notice I want you to take your eyes and follow my finger, okay? The edge of the ridge and valley comes up, and then there's a 90-degree turn, boom. And another 90-degree turn, boom. And it follows this mountain range all the way up. And then look what happens. It comes back again, and then boom. But notice then you've got this perpendicular ridge. It goes this way, and then there's a mountain that goes all the way up this way. What's happened? Any guesses? What's created there? So for the people on the screen, look at this 90-degree turn here, boom. Another 90-degree turn here, boom. Goes all the way up, and then it kind of jogs back down and over. But then look at this ridge here, boom, 90-degree turn, straight long ridge goes up, all the way back up, and then comes back down. What caused that? Chase? Ideas? Yeah, you got a thrust fault, okay? So specifically, that entire block of land, watch what happens with it here, guys. That entire block shifts to the northwest. Watch it again. It shifts to the northwest. That's called the Cumberland Mountain Thrust Block, right? The whole thing was thrust up and over. Think about the same way those rocks slid down the mountain. In this case, they slid up and over the adjacent land, right? That whole thing moved as one unit. And that's why you have that really sort of funky zigzag 90-degree angle there.
When it thrust faults, is it staying connected to all of the rock layers below it, or is it shearing off?
It shears over the top of it. Yeah. And it moved as one mass. So everything you see here is underlain by that same thrust fault and all slid as one unit. What was shoving it? What was, go ahead, Laura.
How do you know? I'm not trying to be contestant here. I can see what you're saying, how that shifted up, but what is the evidence that there to the left, that didn't just shift down?
Well, that's a good point. So I'm going to show you some of that evidence in just a second, and I think
Okay.
that'll probably be the simplest explanation. But
Perfect.
this is where we definitely have to have geologists who have things like drilling equipment that can go down, and also stratigraphers. Remember those people who study the rock layers, right?
Yeah.
And so I'll show you that evidence, and then we'll come back and touch on that.
Perfect.
So this is that the image here in the lower right is called White Cliffs, and this is the mountain range that you see. That is this one right here, this very front range. Okay, and then the back side here, this is called, and by the way, the top of that mountain is often called simply Cumberland Mountain. That's the name of that long ridge. The cliffs themselves are known as the White Cliffs. The other mountain range back here, though, is called Pine Mountain. If anybody's from Kentucky, everybody knows about Pine Mountain. It's a very common sort of place name. It's a very long running mountain here. And then in between, notice how highly dissected it is, right? Lots of very finely dissected mountains, looks very much like this. And that's the area where there's a lot of coal mining in this particular region. Both Cumberland Mountain and Pine Mountain have been upturned. Okay, they've been upturned, and they are mostly sandstone ridges, like you would expect. Very hard erosion-resistant rock. All that stuff in between, though, is exposing softer rocks like coal and shale and siltstone. Not so much limestone, but especially those three, coal, shale, and siltstone, which means it's a highly eroded region. So Cumberland Mountain, farther north in Kentucky, goes by the name of Black Mountain, which is the highest elevation in Kentucky, a little bit over 4,000 feet. Then Pine Mountain. And then the valley that's been left behind, where this big chunk was pushed from, essentially, and has been eroded away, is an important valley called Powell's Valley. Very important valley for the early settlers who moved into this region. And then Cumberland Gap is the notch, and we'll come back and talk about that later, that actually goes through the mountain. There's a gap here that started out 20,000 years ago, was a major animal trail for mastodons and mammoths and stuff. And then Native Americans used it as a trade trail, and it became the trail through which Daniel Boone and many other travelers would later come. So here's a did you have a question, Clayton?
Yeah. Why do we have some?
Great question. This is named after the, so that name originates from the Duke of Cumberland, who was a member of the British aristocracy in the 1740s. It was named by Dr. Thomas Walker, who was an early land surveyor and settler. And at that time, most of our landmarks were being named for British royalty, English royalty, and the Duke of Cumberland was one of those. Now, before then, it's important to remember all these sites, most of these sites had names that were being applied by Native Americans who already lived here for thousands of years. For example, that trail that became, we now know as Cumberland Gap, that trail was called, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of it, Athiomayowie, which is the warrior's trace that connected the northern tribes to the southern tribes. Of course, we totally ignored that history, completely gave it a new name, and now no one knows Athiomayowie. We know it as the Cumberland Gap, named in honor of the Duke of Cumberland and the Cumberland River. Yeah.
You know, the name for the short 8 names.
Warioto.
Pretty good.
Yeah, the Warioto River. And in fact, the Cumberland River, which flows here, begins actually right here on the sides of these mountains. The various forks of the Cumberlands begin here and flow and eventually come down into Nashville and Tennessee and right here through Clarksville. That's where they began. Great question, Clay. All right, so let's take a look at the geologic cross-section of the Cumberland, what are called the Cumberland Mountains or the Central Appalachians. One thing you'll immediately see is you can see that big unit of land, and here's that thrusting, right, that happened where it was pushed up and over. As a result of that, this is a syncline, remember going down, it's a concavity, and the mountains that are above it are sort of in that syncline. I don't know that this is going to be immediately helpful, but the adjacent, you can see this rise here. That was an adjacent area of uplift called an anticline. And all that is sort of has these dashed lines because that's no longer there. That's what we would refer to as a geologic dome. So the Nashville Dome used to be a geologic dome over where Nashville now sits, has eroded into a basin. The Lexington Dome over Lexington, Kentucky, used to be over Kentucky, is now the Bluegrass Basin. So all these geologic structures, which were once elevated, are now topographic low points. Okay, here's another sign of uplift. This is the very leading edge of the Cumberland thrust block on the Tennessee side. These rocks have been totally vertically upturned. The Cumberland Trail, by the way, goes along the back ridge of this mountain. If you ever want to hike that, Sarah, remind us, it goes from what, Chattanooga to Cumberland Gap? Okay. Yeah. It's a long trail, kind of like a mini version of the Appalachian Trail, but you can take it. It goes up through here. Very cool place. This is called the Devil's Racetrack. It's a really cool geologic filter. Here are the White Cliffs of Virginia. This stood out to early settlers because those prominent cliffs told them that they were mere miles away from Cumberland Gap, which is the pass through the mountains by which they would eventually go on to move west of the Appalachians. My ancestors came through Cumberland Gap. Probably many of you in this room, if your people settled into Tennessee, Kentucky, or any points farther west, most likely they came through there. Many of the slaves who came to this region as well in the late 1700s and early 1800s were forcefully brought through Cumberland Gap as well. This is Cumberland Gap. It's a very deep notch. Today, a highway goes through it. You can get out and sort of walk in the saddle of that notch, and it's really cool to think about. Civil War soldiers walked through that notch. Native Americans walked through that notch. Bison walked through that notch. It's one of the most important migratory corridors in all of the North American continent. And so the road that people took, by the way, we'll come back to this later. People like Daniel Boone and many others, again, used that path coming down the Great Valley, and then they cut right through that gap. And that's called the Wilderness Road. That was popularized, name for it in the late 1700s. Hundreds of thousands of early Americans came through that gap on their way west. Okay, now we're going to talk about the next one, the dissected Appalachian Plateaus. Okay, so this is outside the thrust block region. This is everything else sort of in light green, all up to here and down into this region. This is an area, a very important term that I want you to know, called erosional mountains, okay? Basically, the mountains of the southeastern U.S. kind of come in two major categories. There are those that are uplifted mountains, like the Great Smokies and the Blue Ridge, formed by the collision of Africa and North America that thrust them up and folded them and faulted, right? So the rock layers, as you already have seen, are vertical, or they're folded, or they're fractured, okay? That's not what these are. Erosional mountains started as flat surfaces, and all those various layers have begun to erode, forming these erosional remnants, okay? And so in this case, there's just a few areas of erosional mountains in the southeast. The Cumberland Mountains, or dissected Appalachian Plateaus, as they're more technically called, is one example. If you're in Arkansas, the Boston Mountains are also erosional mountains. And if you're down around Suwannee or Huntsville, Alabama, the lower edge of the Cumberland Plateau is also called, it's an area called the Jackson Mountains, which are erosional mountains. And so here's what we mean by that. These are not uplifted. These are completely flat-lying sedimentary rocks. They have never had any effects from mountain building forced upon them. So all the layers are totally horizontal perfectly, as you would expect if they were laid down in various depositional environments many, many millions of years ago, in shallow seas, in mud flats, in deep oceans. Okay, here's what they look like. If you drive through and see those road cuts, you see that they are entirely flat-lying strata, and they repeat in a very regular order. Remember those terms, transgressions and regressions, right? Where a given spot, depending on the depth of the ocean, right, it gets deeper or shallower, and then we get that change back and forth between different layers over time. That's what's causing this repeated back and forth, back and forth. And so because of that, you can go from these black layers, which are former coal swamps, resulting in today coal formations. Then you go to a shale, like a freshwater shale. Then you go to a limestone, and then a siltstone, maybe a sandstone. Then you go and you repeat that over and over and over again for hundreds and hundreds of feet. Okay. Geologically speaking, the term for that is called a cyclothem. That's where you have these repeated patterns of geologic layers. So here's a cyclothem, for example, these repetitious patterns. Okay, why is this area important in Tennessee? Well, number one, it's one of the areas of greatest poverty. Okay, this is an area of extreme rural poverty, very high rates of drug abuse, very high rates of fentanyl deaths, very high rates of infant mortality, high rates of illiteracy, very high poverty rates. It's an extremely rural area. And it happens to also be an area that has witnessed extreme economic downturn, particularly from the collapse of the coal mining industry over the decades. A lot of these towns have been boom and bust towns. They were big in the 40s and the 50s. And then when the mines wore out or environmental regulations shifted, some of these towns completely dried up. And they are very depressing places to go to in many cases, but they're also extremely beautiful places to visit. These areas have a lot of public lands today. This is one of the areas where elk has been reintroduced into Tennessee and roams wild over the mountains in Kentucky and Tennessee. But sadly, coal is a defining feature of this region in some bad ways too. You can see the coal deposits are extremely abundant up in here. That's that thrust block right there. There's a lot of coal right there. Why does this area suffer? Well, in part, it's difficult to get to those coal seams, right? They're buried underneath those other rock layers that you need to get rid of to access this coal. Otherwise, you could have coal mines going underground, which are very dangerous and resulting in black lung and all kinds of deadly conditions, the risk of collapse. And so to mitigate for that, it's much easier to remove the mountaintop entirely, right? You just blast the entire mountain top off, and you shove all that rock into the adjacent valleys, which does what? It jams up the rivers and the streams, and it results in massive pollution, which threatens an already threatened population. We do have some amazing public lands here. Some of the largest recent land acquisitions in Tennessee and Virginia, Kentucky, hundreds of thousands of acres have been recently purchased by the Nature Conservancy in partnership with Jeff Bezos, former CEO of Amazon, of the Bezos Earth Fund. They bought over 100,000 acres of land. State parks like Frozen Head State Park are beautiful places to visit and hike. Now, you'll see then that these uplifted mountains here in this little schematic diagram are basically represented here as the Central Appalachians. Now what we want to do is step off of those mountains to the south and west onto a tableland or a plateau, which is what we call in Tennessee, we refer to it as the Cumberland Plateau.